Okay, so look, I messed up. I know that now, though I didn't think it at the time. It's funny how hindsight works, how you can pinpoint the exact moment when everything shifted, but only when it's too late to take it back. It wasn't like I planned it. I didn't wake up that morning thinking, today's the day I push him away. Today's the day I ruin something good. No, it was subtle, stupid even. A passing comment at a party, tossed out like a joke, but the kind of joke that sticks like a splinter under the skin. I told someone I was single. I didn't mean it, obviously. I was married, still am, technically. But I said it with a laugh, with a careless flick of my wrist, and I can still hear my own voice in my head, light and breezy, like it didn't matter. Like it wasn't true. Except for 1 second, one breath, maybe it felt a little true. And that's the part I can't stop thinking about. It was a party we'd both been invited to. One of those things where the drinks flow too easily and everyone acts like they've known each other forever, even when they've just met. The music was loud, the lights were dim, and the whole place hummed with that electric, buzzing energy of people who are a little too eager to escape their own lives for a few hours. I remember standing there, watching my husband talk to someone across the room, a beer in his hand, his face half lit by the neon glow of the bar sign. He looked relaxed, comfortable, unbothered. And it wasn't that he ignored me, not exactly. It was more that he was fine without me. I don't know why that felt like a slap. I should have been happy about it, I think. Secure, but I wasn't. I was restless, wound up in a way I couldn't quite place, and when someone leaned in and asked if I was here alone, I smiled and said, "Might as well be." That was the first mistake. The guy laughed, took another sip of his drink, and grinned like we were sharing some private little joke. Maybe that's what I wanted, a secret moment that belonged just to me. Nothing serious, nothing that meant anything, just a sliver of something different. I can't even tell you what we talked about, something dumb, something that made me laugh a little too easily. I liked the way he looked at me like I was new, like I wasn't just a familiar shape in the background of someone else's life. I didn't realize my husband had been watching. Not then. I kept playing along, letting the night stretch out, letting myself feel untethered for once. And then someone, God, I don't even remember who, said something offhand, something teasing like, "Careful, don't have too much fun or your husband might get jealous." I laughed. I didn't even look for him. That was the second mistake, because when I did finally scan the room again, he was gone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he stepped outside for air, maybe he went to the bathroom, maybe he was just in some other corner of the party. But as the minutes passed and the drinks kept coming, I felt a gnawing little itch in my chest. I checked my phone, no message, no missed call. I told myself I was overreacting. That's what I do. I overthink things, spin them into something bigger than they are. He was probably just tired. Probably just went home early. No big deal. But something about it felt big. I stayed longer than I should have, lingering in conversations that no longer felt as fun as they did an hour ago. That light, weightless feeling was gone, replaced by something I didn't have a name for yet. Eventually, I grabbed my coat, said my goodbyes, and left. I expected to find him at home. I expected a half-asleep, mumbled greeting from the couch or maybe silence from the bedroom. What I didn't expect was the absence. No shoes by the door, no keys on the counter. He wasn't there. That's when the buzzing under my skin turned sharp, slicing through my earlier carelessness like a blade. I called him. No answer. I told myself not to be dramatic. Maybe he was just somewhere else. Maybe he went out for a drive. Maybe he stopped for a drink somewhere quiet. Maybe. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at my phone, debating if I should try again. The longer I sat there, the more I felt it. The emptiness stretching wide between us, an invisible space I had been pretending wasn't there for longer than just tonight. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside our window. I kept picturing him, wondering where he was, what he was thinking, what he saw tonight. Did he hear what I said? Did he see the way I leaned in, the way I let myself bask in the warmth of someone else's attention? Was this the moment he decided something was broken, because something was broken? I just didn't know if it could be fixed. I woke up with my phone still in my hand, the screen dim, my fingers stiff from gripping it all night. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. The house was silent, and that silence pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. I rolled over, pulling the blanket over my head like I could block out the gnawing feeling in my gut, but it didn't help. The absence was still there, thick in the air. I told myself not to panic. He'd come home. He had to. I forced myself out of bed, moving through the motions of the morning like I wasn't waiting for something. Some sign, some explanation, some proof that I hadn't made a mistake I couldn't take back. I left my phone on the counter while I made coffee, refusing to stare at it, refusing to let the silence stretch any further. But when the front door finally opened, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn right away. I kept my back to him, fingers tight around my coffee mug. If I turned too fast, if I looked too eager, he'd see it. He'd see the guilt crawling under my skin, the worry pooling behind my eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just the sound of him setting his keys down, the rustling of fabric as he shrugged off his jacket. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. You didn't come home last night. I kept my voice even, like I wasn't accusing him of anything, like I wasn't fraying at the edges. He didn't answer immediately. I turned, watching as he moved into the kitchen, opening the fridge like this was just any other morning. I figured you'd be too busy to notice, he said finally, pulling out a bottle of water. His voice was flat, unreadable, but I heard it. The weight beneath the words. A sharp sting shot through me, though I wasn't sure if it was anger or something else. That's not fair, I said, setting my mug down with more force than necessary. He took a slow sip of water, his gaze flicking to mine. Isn't it? Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was knowing. Like he had already played this conversation out in his head and had no interest in fighting about it. I hated that. I wanted him to say something. Yell, accuse, anything but stand there with that quiet detachment, that frustrating calm. Where were you? I asked. He twisted the cap back onto the bottle, set it down on the counter. Out? That's not an answer. He shrugged. Neither was yours last night. His words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. My throat tightened, my pulse hammering against my ribs. This is ridiculous, I said, crossing my arms, trying to push down the rising heat in my chest. I didn't do anything. He let out a quiet breath, something that might have been a laugh if it weren't so empty. Yeah, he said. That's the problem, isn't it? And then he left the room. I stood there, stunned, watching him disappear down the hall like he had just made a decision. When I wasn't sure I was ready for, I followed him. I didn't plan to, didn't even think about it. I just moved, my feet carrying me down the hall before I could talk myself out of it. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He was in the bedroom, standing near the dresser, unbuttoning the cuff of his sleeve like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look up, didn't stop moving. Just kept going like this conversation was already over. That's the problem, I repeated, stepping closer. What does that even mean? He finally glanced at me, his expression still unreadable. That quiet, unsettling calm. It means, he said, voice steady, that you didn't do anything. And that's the part that keeps sticking with me. I blinked, my stomach twisting, frustration bubbling up hot in my chest. Would you just say what you mean? He tilted his head, considering me for a moment, like he was trying to decide if I was worth explaining this to. Like maybe I already knew, and this was a waste of his time. You act like last night was just, what? A joke, a little fun? His voice didn't rise, but there was something in it now, something taut and controlled. You said you were single, you leaned into it. You wanted someone to see you like that. The air between us felt thinner suddenly, the room too small. It was just a stupid joke, I said, but the words felt weak, even to me, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Right, a joke. I wanted him to push back, to argue, to fight, but he didn't. And somehow, that made it worse. I wasn't doing anything you haven't done, I said, my arms crossing over my chest. It came out defensive, but I didn't care. You didn't seem to care when I was standing right next to you, so why does it matter now? His eyes darkened, just a fraction. You think this is about me caring? I swallowed, suddenly unsure. He let out a quiet breath, shaking his head like he didn't even have the energy for this. You wanted to feel single. Fine, maybe you were, maybe we both were. The words settled like ice in my spine. I forced out a breath, trying to steady myself. Where did you go? He didn't answer right away, just watched me, something unreadable in his gaze. Out, he said finally. I shook my head. That's not an answer. A pause, a heartbeat of silence, and then neither was yours last night. I felt it like a punch to the stomach. My throat tightened, fingers curling into my palms. You're really going to turn this around on me? He exhaled, slow and even, running a hand over his jaw. I don't think you get it. Then explain it to me. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for the first time I saw something crack beneath the surface. I watched you, he said. I saw you smiling at him, laughing, leaning in. I heard what you said. Something sharp twisted in my chest. You saw me and what? You decided to leave. You didn't even say anything, you just... I gestured toward the door, trying to keep my voice from shaking. What were you doing all night then? He didn't answer right away, but he didn't look away either. Do you really want to know? The question hung between us, heavy and loaded. I opened my mouth, then hesitated, because the truth was I wasn't sure if I did. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to demand an answer, force him to lay it all out, tell me exactly what he had done and where he had been, so I could grab onto it and use it against him. I wanted a reason to be angry, something tangible, something worse than the sick, uncertain feeling curdling inside me, but I hesitated. And in that hesitation, he knew. A slow exhale left him, something almost like disappointment flickering across his face before he looked away. He rolled his shoulders, stretching out some tension I hadn't even noticed he was holding, and then he sat down on the edge of the bed like this was just another conversation. Like we weren't standing on the edge of something irreversible. I hated how calm he looked. I don't think you do, he said, voice quiet. Because if you did, you'd already be asking the right questions. My stomach twisted. And what are the right questions? He rubbed his hands together, studying the floor for a moment before looking up at me. Why did I leave? Why didn't I call? Why am I not angry right now? I scoffed, arms crossing tighter over my chest. And I'm supposed to just read between the lines, try to guess? His gaze didn't waver. You already know. The certainty in his voice sent something cold down my spine. I wanted to argue. Wanted to insist I had no idea what he was talking about, but the truth was, I did, and that scared me more than anything. I took a slow, careful breath, choosing my words with precision. You're trying to punish me. That made him laugh, low and humorless, shaking his head. No. I think you already handled that yourself. I clenched my jaw, heat prickling the back of my neck. I didn't do anything. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, like he was watching me dig myself into a hole and deciding whether or not to let me keep going. You keep saying that, he murmured, almost to himself. Like it makes a difference. I felt my pulse in my throat, fast and uneven. You're acting like I cheated on you. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time I saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, not hurt, just exhaustion. I don't think you cheated, he said slowly. I think you wanted to. A sharp breath left me, my whole body tensing like I had been slapped. That's not, I started, but he cut me off before I could finish. It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about why you did it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching me carefully. Because it wasn't an accident, it wasn't just a joke. You said it because you wanted to feel single for a night. Because you wanted to see if someone would look at you like you were still worth chasing. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. That's not fair. Maybe not, he said, but it's true. The room was too quiet, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest, squeezing. I opened my mouth, ready to argue, but I didn't know what to say, because he wasn't wrong. I didn't cheat. I didn't kiss anyone, didn't let things go too far, but I wanted something that wasn't him, wasn't us, and I had let that want guide my choices. I forced myself to meet his gaze. You still haven't told me where you were last night. His eyes searched mine for a long moment. Then I went to a bar. Something in my stomach dropped. With who? My voice was quieter than I meant it to be, a beat of silence. Then, does it matter? My pulse pounded in my ears. Yes. He studied me, expression unreadable, and for the first time I saw hesitation in him too. Finally, he said, I ran into someone. The air in my lungs turned sharp. Someone. He held my gaze, didn't elaborate, didn't give me an easy answer to twist into something harmless. I took a slow step back, my arms falling to my sides. And his jaw tightened, but his voice stayed maddeningly even. And nothing. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But the way he was looking at me, like he was waiting for me to understand something without him having to say it out loud, I felt something crack inside me. "You're trying to prove a point," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "No. I think you proved it for both of us." I stared at him, my chest rising and falling too fast. He didn't move, didn't try to explain himself, didn't rush to comfort me, because maybe he was waiting just like I had waited. And now I understood why it felt so awful. The first one found me the very next day. I was sitting in a quiet corner of a cafe, flipping through my Bible, searching for something, anything, that would confirm what I had seen. The words blurred together, passages I had read 1,000 times suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as if they were hiding something just beneath the surface. I could feel it, this truth pressing against my mind, waiting to be uncovered. Then I heard a voice. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" I glanced up, startled. A man stood across from me, young, maybe in his late 20s, with dark, searching eyes and an air of quiet intensity. He wasn't a stranger. I recognized him, though we had never spoken beyond polite nods at church. His name was Elijah, and from what little I knew, he was the kind of believer who rarely spoke but always seemed deep in thought, as if carrying burdens no one else could see. I hesitated. "What makes you say that?" He pulled out the chair across from me and sat without asking. "Because I've been looking, too." A chill ran through me. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Something's coming, isn't it?" I didn't answer right away. I studied his face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of test, that he was playing games with me, but I saw none. Instead, I saw the same restlessness that had been gnawing at my own heart since I woke up in that hospital bed. I exhaled slowly. "Yes," I said. "It is." His shoulders slumped with relief, as if he had been carrying that thought alone for far too long. "I knew it," he muttered. I knew I wasn't crazy. I frowned. "What have you seen?" He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking slightly. "Not the way you have," he admitted. "Not in visions, but I've felt it. The signs, the shifting in the world. Things are falling apart, but it's not just political, not just the economy or the wars. It's something deeper, something spiritual, and nobody wants to talk about it." I nodded. "Because if they talk about it, they have to acknowledge it, and if they acknowledge it, they have to change." His eyes darkened. "Exactly." For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of what we both understood pressing between us. Then he asked, "What did you see?" I hesitated. I had been so desperate to tell someone, but now that the opportunity was here, I realized how impossible it was to put into words. How could I describe Jesus standing before me? How could I explain the terror and beauty of the future he had revealed? But Elijah was waiting, and something inside me whispered, "He's ready," so I told him. I told him about the accident, about waking up in the golden expanse beyond this world. I told him about Jesus, his voice like thunder and whisper, his eyes full of sorrow and love. I told him about the storm, the war, the deception, about 2030 and what was coming. And I told him about our people, the forgotten truth of who we were and the choice we would have to make. When I finally stopped, my hands were clenched into fists on the table, my breath uneven. Elijah didn't move. He just stared at me, his face unreadable, his lips slightly parted as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Finally, he spoke. "Daniel," he whispered, This is what I've been searching for. This is what's been missing." I swallowed. "You believe me?" His eyes snapped up to mine. "I don't just believe you. I've been waiting for you." A shiver ran down my spine. Then, before I could say anything else, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with frantic, messy handwriting. He slid it across the table to me. I scanned the words, my heart pounding faster with each line. They weren't just his thoughts. They were mine. The same scriptures I had been drawn to, the same warnings that had burned in my mind ever since my return. Passages I had never noticed before, suddenly leaping off the page in a way they never had. "How?" I breathed. Elijah's voice was steady. "Because he's been speaking to us, Daniel, and now we have to figure out why." The air between us shifted, the gravity of the moment settling deep in my bones. I had found the first one, and I knew there would be more. I sat down before my legs could give out beneath me. The bed dipped under my weight, the mattress cool against my palms. I felt lightheaded, like the air in the room had thinned, like I was only just now realizing how deep the water had gotten before I started drowning. He hadn't cheated. At least, I didn't think so. But then again, wasn't that the same thing I had told myself about my own actions? That it didn't count because I hadn't done anything. That nothing happened, so nothing changed, except everything had changed. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what that meant. I forced myself to look up at him. "Did you do this to hurt me?" His expression didn't shift. He wasn't cold. He wasn't angry. He just was. "No," he said. "I did it because I didn't want to sit in an empty house waiting for you to decide whether you were still in this marriage or not." His words cut deeper than anything else he could have said. I felt them in my ribs, sharp and unavoidable. I swallowed, my throat tight. I never said I wanted to leave. His lips pressed together and then he nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Right." A small pause. "You just wanted to see what it felt like." I flinched. He had me pinned, no room to wriggle out. I hated how well he knew me. My fingers dug into the bedsheets, my mind scrambling for a way to turn this around, to find some way to make this not my fault. But every argument that formed in my head fell apart before I could say it out loud. Finally, I asked, "Did you?" I stopped, shook my head. "Did she?" "I didn't sleep with her," he said. I didn't realize how tightly I had been holding my breath until it rushed out of me in a sharp, uneven exhale. "But," he continued, watching me carefully, "I thought about it. My stomach twisted violently. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. I was supposed to be the one in control. I had spent the night pretending I was untethered, pretending I was free, and now suddenly I felt the weight of that choice, the full force of what I had set in motion. He had thought about it. He had thought about someone else, just like I had. I let out a shaky breath and dragged a hand through my hair, fingers trembling. "I didn't want this." His gaze was heavy. "Didn't you?" "No." The word came out too fast. He exhaled through his nose, then nodded again like he was deciding something. "Okay." That was it, just okay. My pulse pounded in my ears. "So what now?" He didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand over his face, then let it drop to his side. His jaw clenched. I could see the muscles in his neck tense before he finally said, "I don't know." For some reason, that scared me more than anything else. I would have preferred anger. I would have preferred something, but I don't know, felt dangerous. It felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet, like something I couldn't control. I pressed my lips together, forcing down the knot in my throat. "Are you leaving?" The question hung between us, heavy and real. He looked at me for a long time. Too long. Then, finally, he exhaled and sat down on the bed beside me, careful to keep a small space between us. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. "I don't know," he said again, voice quieter this time. I squeezed my eyes shut. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to reach for him, to rewind the last 24 hours, to pretend none of this had happened. But the problem was, it had happened, and there was no undoing it. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, pressing down on my ribs. I felt like if I moved too fast, if I breathed too hard, something would break. He sat beside me, unmoving. I could feel the space between us, the way neither of us wanted to close it first. I turned my head slightly, watching his profile. He was staring at the floor, jaw tense, fingers laced together like he was holding something back. "I don't know what you want me to say," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "Neither do I." The simplicity of the statement hit harder than it should have. I swallowed, my throat tight. "So what now?" He shifted, finally looking at me, and I wished he hadn't. There was something in his expression I couldn't face, something tired, something resigned. "You tell me," he said. The words sat between us like a dare, a challenge, but the thing was I didn't have an answer. I had spent so much time convincing myself that my actions hadn't mattered, that what I had done was nothing, but now I could see the wreckage left in their wake. I dropped my gaze to my hands, fisting the fabric of my jeans between my fingers. "I didn't think it would matter." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I know." My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what I expected. Reassurance? anger, some kind of passionate outburst that would make me feel like at least I had meant something to him. But instead, he was just sitting there, quietly accepting what I had done, letting it settle. It was worse. I wasn't looking for anything, I said, a weak attempt to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. He nodded like he already knew that. And yet, I let out a shaky breath, my fingers curling tighter. I don't know why I did it. That's a lie. I flinched, but I didn't argue because it was a lie. I knew exactly why I had done it. I had wanted something I wasn't getting. I had wanted to be seen, to feel like I had choices, to feel like I was still desirable. And yet, sitting here looking at him, all of it felt childish, like playing with matches just to see if I could start a fire, and now watching it burn out of control. His voice softened, but only slightly. I'm not stupid. I looked up, my chest aching. I never said you were. He studied me for a long time, and I hated the way it made me feel, exposed, like I couldn't hide from this anymore. I didn't leave to hurt you, he said finally. I swallowed. I know, but I did leave. I nodded, the weight of those words pressing down on me. He exhaled, dragging a hand over his face before finally standing. He took a step away from me like he needed the distance to think, to breathe. I don't want to be the only one holding this together, he said, voice low. I don't want to sit here and pretend this was nothing just because you don't want to admit it meant something. I clenched my jaw. I didn't cheat. He turned, his expression unreadable. Maybe not. A pause. But you wanted to. The words hit like a gut punch, and I hated that I had no defense. I wanted. I stopped, shaking my head, unsure of how to finish that sentence. His eyes flicked over my face like he was waiting for me to figure it out. I let out a breath, looking away. I don't want to lose you. Then don't. The simplicity of it made my throat tighten, like it was that easy. Like I could just snap my fingers and make this disappear. I finally looked back at him. Is that even possible? His expression softened just a fraction. I don't know, he admitted. That depends on you. I nodded slowly, heart hammering. Are you coming home tonight? I asked, voice unsteady. He didn't answer right away. He studied me, weighing something in his mind, and then, finally, I don't know. The words landed like a stone in my stomach, and I realized that for the first time I wasn't the one in control anymore. The moment stretched between us, thin and fragile, like a thread pulled too tight. I wanted to reach for him, to do something, anything, that would make this feel less real. But I stayed where I was, fingers curled into my lap, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. His answer sat heavy in the air. I don't know, it shouldn't have surprised me. But it did, because suddenly, for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe I wasn't the only one with a choice to make. I want you to stay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there with that same unreadable expression, like he was waiting to see if I really meant it. I don't know if that's enough, he said. A sharp pang shot through my chest, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. What do you mean? His jaw clenched and he let out a slow breath. I mean, I don't want to stay just because you're scared of what happens if I leave. My stomach twisted. That's not. I stopped, pressing my lips together. That's not why I want you here. He studied me, silent. I swallowed hard, my throat thick. I know I messed up. The words felt small, too small for what I had done. I know I hesitated, then exhaled, forcing myself to say it. I wanted to see if I could still make someone look at me the way you used to. There, the truth. It sat between us, raw and exposed, and I wanted to take it back as soon as I said it. But I couldn't. His eyes darkened, his fingers twitching at his sides. He turned slightly, like he was about to say something, then stopped. A small, bitter laugh left him instead. That's the thing, he murmured, shaking his head. You didn't even notice, did you? I frowned, my stomach knotting. Notice what? He met my gaze, and I felt it, felt the weight of what he was about to say before the words even left his lips. I was looking at you, he said, voice quiet but steady. The whole damn time. Something in my chest cracked wide open. I sucked in a breath, my fingers tightening against my thighs. You think I stopped seeing you? His voice wasn't angry, just tired. I didn't, I just figured you already knew. A lump formed in my throat, hot and painful. I watched you at that party, he continued, his voice lower now, more measured. I watched you smile at him. I watched you laugh like you were trying to prove something, and I kept waiting for you to look back at me. My breath hitched. But you didn't. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers pressing against my temples. I didn't mean... I know, he said. That's the worst part. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. I thought you didn't care. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. I cared. A pause. I just didn't know if it mattered to you anymore. My heart twisted painfully. It did. God, it did. But I had spent so much time looking for something else. Something more, that I hadn't even realized I still had exactly what I wanted. I forced my gaze up to meet his, but he was already looking away, his shoulders tense. For the first time, I felt something close to panic. I had been so sure he would always be there, that no matter what, no matter how many times I pulled, he would never let go. But now I wasn't sure anymore. I don't want to lose you, I whispered. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. You might not have a choice, he said. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, the sound of his footsteps disappearing down the hall, my pulse hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. My hands felt numb in my lap, my breath uneven, like I had just been hit by something I hadn't seen coming. But I had seen it coming, hadn't I? I had been daring him to react. Pushing, pulling, testing the limits without ever thinking I'd actually reach them. And now here I was, sitting in the wreckage of my own making, watching him walk away. My body felt disconnected from my mind when I finally pushed myself up, moving on instinct, my legs unsteady as I followed. The house felt bigger than it should have, each step too loud against the floor, the distance between us stretching further with every second. By the time I reached the living room, he was already at the door. Where are you going? My voice came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. He didn't look at me. He just stood there for a moment, fingers flexing at his sides before reaching for his jacket draped over the back of the chair. I don't know, he said, and I hated how steady he sounded. I swallowed, my heart pounding. So that's it, you're just leaving? Finally, he turned, his eyes locking onto mine. I braced myself for anger, for something heated, something real that I could grab onto, but all I saw was exhaustion. I don't want to fight with you, he said. The words deflated me. Then don't. My voice was smaller now, raw. Stay, talk to me. He let out a slow breath, running a hand over his jaw before shaking his head. I don't think that's what you really want. I stepped forward, my pulse stuttering. Of course it is. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Is it, or do you just not want to deal with what happens if I walk out that door? Something inside me twisted, hard and sharp, because I didn't have an answer for that, because maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't know what I wanted. Maybe I had spent so long towing the edge, testing the boundaries, that I had convinced myself nothing bad would happen if I kept pushing. But now he was here, standing on the other side of that invisible line, and I wasn't sure if I could pull him back. I forced down the lump in my throat, my voice unsteady. So what? You're just done. His lips parted, but then he hesitated like he was still weighing the answer himself. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. No, I don't think so. The tight grip on my chest loosened, but only slightly. But I don't know what this is anymore, he admitted, his voice quieter. I don't know how to fix this. My breath caught. I don't either, I whispered. We stood there, inches apart but miles away, both waiting for the other to figure out the answer. For the first time, I realized there might not be one. I had always assumed love was enough. That no matter what happened, no matter how many fights or missteps, we would always find our way back to each other. But now, looking at him, I wasn't sure if love had anything to do with this at all. I don't want you to go, I said, because it was the only thing I was certain of. He studied me for a long time. Then give me a reason to stay. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I had one. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My brain scrambled for words, for something solid, something convincing, something that would keep him here. But the harder I searched, the more I realized. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to say I loved him. But that felt too easy, too expected, like a Band-Aid over a wound that was too deep to ignore. I wanted to say we could fix this, that I would change, that I would try. But try what? Try to be happy, try to want only him. try to ignore whatever part of me had been looking for something else in the first place. My silence stretched between us, growing heavier by the second. His jaw tightened, and I could see the moment he decided something. Not out of anger, not out of spite, just quiet, exhausted certainty. He stepped back, and this time I felt it, the space widening. The shift, the pull, the inevitability of it. He reached for the door handle. Panic clawed at my chest. My pulse was everywhere, in my fingertips, behind my eyes, in my throat. I moved before I could stop myself, reaching out, fingers wrapping around his wrist. "Please," I whispered. His body stilled, but he didn't turn. For a second, neither of us moved. My grip on his wrist was light, barely there, but I could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his pulse. The same pulse I had rested my head against for years. The same hands that had held me through fights, through laughter, through the worst and best parts of ourselves. I had never imagined a day where I would have to ask him to stay. I squeezed my eyes shut, inhaling sharply. I don't know what to say. His exhale was quiet, controlled. I know. My voice broke, and I forced myself to swallow to steady it. I don't know how we got here. He let out a breath, and this time I felt his muscles tense beneath my fingers. Then, finally, he turned to look at me. His expression wasn't angry, it wasn't cold, it was just sad, and somehow that made it worse. "You do know," he said quietly. "You just don't want to admit it." My throat tightened. He was right. I did know. I had spent so much time searching for an excuse, for something I could blame that wasn't me. I had convinced myself that what I did hadn't mattered, that it wasn't enough to change anything. But that wasn't true. I had changed everything. And now, I didn't know if there was any way to fix it. He exhaled again, long and slow, and I felt his hand shift beneath mine. For a second, I thought he was going to pull away, but he didn't. Instead, his fingers turned, sliding into mine. A slow, measured movement, like he wasn't even sure what he was doing until it was already happening. I held my breath. He looked down at our hands, the way they fit together, familiar and uncertain all at once. Then, after a long moment, he met my gaze again. "I don't want to hate you for this," he admitted. "But I might if I stay." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced them back. "And if you go?" His jaw clenched, and he shook his head once like he hated the answer before he even gave it. "I don't know." I nodded, just barely, because that was the thing neither of us did. We were standing on the edge of something fragile, something dangerous, something that had no guarantee of being saved. But for now, for this moment, he wasn't walking away, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Neither of us moving, neither of us speaking, both of us feeling the weight of something we couldn't name. His hand was still in mine, warm but hesitant, like he was testing whether I'd let go first. I didn't dare, because I knew the second I let go, it would be real. I wasn't sure how long we stood there, but eventually, he sighed. His fingers tightened around mine briefly before he pulled away, slow and deliberate, like he didn't want it to feel like a rejection. But it wasn't cruel, it wasn't angry. It was just final. I stepped back, my chest aching, my arms suddenly feeling too empty. "I need some air," he murmured. I nodded, even though I hated the sound of it. He hesitated, studying me for a moment like he wanted to say something else. Maybe something that would make this easier. But there was nothing left to say, so he turned and walked out the door, and this time I let him go. The silence of the house swallowed me whole. I pressed my palms against my face, inhaling deeply, trying to steady myself. I had no idea where he was going. I had no idea if he'd come back. But I didn't chase him. I could have. A month ago, a week ago, yesterday, I would have. I would have run after him, pulled him back, made promises, said whatever I needed to say to keep him here. But that was the problem, wasn't it? I had spent so much time trying to keep things the way they were, trying to pretend we weren't changing, that I hadn't stopped to ask if we were even supposed to stay the same. I let out a slow breath, looking around the house, really seeing it for the first time in what felt like years. Our life was here, our memories. The good, the bad, all of it tangled together in ways I had taken for granted. But what did any of it mean if we weren't the same people anymore? I walked to the couch and sank into it, resting my head against the back, staring at the ceiling. The house felt too quiet without him. It always had. I closed my eyes, and I waited. I don't know how much time passed. maybe minutes, maybe hours, but eventually the front door opened again. I didn't move at first. I just listened, waiting for the sound of his footsteps, waiting to hear if they were uncertain or determined. They were slow, careful. I turned my head, my breath catching when I saw him standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jacket hanging open, his eyes darker than before. I searched his face, looking for some kind of answer, some sign that told me where we stood. I didn't know where to go, he admitted. Something in my chest cracked. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling heavily before looking at me again. He stopped, shaking his head. I thought about leaving, really leaving. My throat tightened, and his gaze softened just a little, and I ended up back here. A lump formed in my throat, and I had to swallow hard to keep it down. That has to mean something, I whispered. He nodded slowly, stepping further inside, letting the door close behind him. Maybe, he said. I sat up, my heart hammering, watching as he hesitated. Then, cautiously, carefully, he sat down beside me, not too close, not far away, just there. And for the first time, I didn't try to close the distance. I just let us be. The night stretched on, slow and quiet. Neither of us moved much, both sitting there on the couch, staring ahead like if we just stayed still long enough, an answer would reveal itself. I wanted to fill the silence, to say something that would make this easier, something that would pull us back from the edge. But the words weren't there. Maybe that was the point. Maybe words weren't what we needed, so we sat. And for the first time in a long time, we let the weight of everything settle between us without rushing to brush it away. After a while, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't want to wake up tomorrow and feel like nothing changed. I turned my head slightly, watching him. It has, he exhaled slowly. Has it? I nodded, swallowing hard. We can't undo this. He was quiet for a long time, like he was letting that sink in, like he was feeling it in the same way I was. Finally, he nodded. No, we can't. A part of me had hoped for some sort of resolution, some moment of clarity that would tell us where we were supposed to go next. But maybe that wasn't how this worked. Maybe there wasn't a clear answer. Maybe it wasn't about fixing it overnight. Maybe it was just about deciding whether or not we wanted to try. I shifted slightly, turning my body toward him. I don't want to lose you. He inhaled sharply, then let it out slowly, shaking his head. I don't want to lose us. Something inside me cracked wide open. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to press my forehead to his and promise that we could figure this out, that we could come back from this, that we weren't too far gone. But I didn't. Instead, I asked, do you think we can find our way back? His eyes met mine, searching, uncertain. I don't know. My heart clenched, but I nodded, accepting it. Do you want to? A pause. A slow, heavy exhale. Then, yeah. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally slipped out of me. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't a promise, but it was something. He turned his head slightly, looking at me in that way he used to, back when everything between us felt simple, easy. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we weren't done yet. Maybe we still had something left to fight for. Neither of us moved closer. But neither of us moved away. And for now, for tonight, that was enough. The next morning, I woke before him. For a few minutes, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing beside me. It was steady, even familiar. A sound I had taken for granted more times than I could count. I turned my head, watching him, tracing the lines of his face, the soft crease between his brows even in sleep. He always slept on his side, one arm tucked beneath the pillow, his body curled just slightly inward. I used to fit myself against him so easily, tucking my knees behind his, pressing my face into the back of his shoulder. It had been instinct, second nature. I couldn't remember the last time I had done that. The thought settled heavy in my chest. How long had I been slipping away without realizing it? How long had I been waiting for him to pull me back, instead of reaching for him myself? He stirred slightly, inhaling deeply, then blinked his eyes open. For a second, there was just groggy confusion, the weight of sleep still clinging to him. But then his gaze found mine, and I saw it, the moment he remembered. His body tensed just slightly, like he wasn't sure if this morning was different from every other morning, or if we had just drifted back into the same pattern, the same quiet avoidance. I didn't want to avoid it anymore. "Hey," I murmured. His brows pulled together slightly, like he hadn't expected me to be awake. "Hey," he said back, his voice rough with sleep. I hesitated for half a second then, before I could overthink it. I reached out. Just a small movement, my fingers brushing over the back of his hand where it rested on the pillow. He didn't pull away. That tiny, almost imperceptible relief settled deep in my bones. For a long moment, we just stayed like that, quiet, still. Then he exhaled, rolling onto his back, staring up at the ceiling. "I don't know what happens next," I swallowed, nodding slightly. "Me neither." Another silence stretched between us, but this one felt different. Less like a wall, more like a space we were finally acknowledging. I took a slow breath. I think I stopped trying. His eyes flicked to mine, but he didn't say anything. I forced myself to keep going. Not just last night, not just at the party, before that, a long time before that. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers flexing against the pillow. "I don't know why," I admitted. "I don't know if it was boredom or fear or just—" I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "But I know I hurt you." His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I don't want to pretend it didn't happen," I said. "I don't want to brush it under the rug and go back to the way things were." His gaze searched mine. "Then what do you want?" I hesitated. And then, instead of answering, I laced my fingers through his breath caught, just barely. "I want to figure it out," I said. "I want to start over." He didn't respond right away. He just watched me, expression unreadable, his thumb brushing just once against my knuckles. Finally, he sighed. "Starting over doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen." I nodded. "I know." His grip tightened slightly. "It's going to take time." "I know that too." He turned his head fully, his face so close now that I could see the way his eyelashes flickered when he blinked, the way his lips parted slightly before pressing back together. "I don't know if I can trust you the same way again," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed past the ache in my throat. "I wouldn't expect you to." His eyes stayed locked on mine for a long, long moment. Then finally, slowly, he nodded. I let out a breath, my chest tight, my fingers still tangled with his. This wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or an easy fix wrapped up in the span of a single conversation. But it was something. A beginning, maybe, or at least the chance of one. And for now, that was enough.